Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve. What is it? What does it mean? How do you use it? Essentially, just covering all of the basics that we need to about the hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve. Pretty much to start out, to give you an example of what it is, it's a curve that talks about the total percent of hemoglobin that is bound to oxygen. So you can think of hemoglobin as a big bucket, and this is how much oxygen can fit into that bucket. It's not a straight line; it's a curve. So it's an S-shaped curve, which means that it doesn't hold equally at all amounts, and you can really never get it 100% full. You can get it pretty close, but not exactly 100%. The interesting thing about the curve is that we can shift where it is, and it does shift depending on a variety of different types of factors that affect how hemoglobin, a protein, allows oxygen to bind to the iron portions of it. We can either shift it to the right, that I have drawn in blue, or to the left, which I have drawn in red. Uh, Leftward shifts are not as common but do occur. A rightward shift is fairly common and will occur fairly often, specifically in respirating tissue or tissue that is going through respiration. So we have our curve. To create a rightward shift, we can either increase carbon dioxide, increase hydrogen ions, which is actually a decrease in pH, increase heat, or increase a byproduct of the respiration process at high altitudes. It's just a common byproduct that happens when you break down glucose, and that is called 2,3-BPG. So once again, an increase in CO2, an increase in H+, an increase in heat, and an increase in 2,3-BPG. It's easiest to think of all of them as an increase, but realize that an increase in hydrogen ions means that it's actually going to be a decrease in pH. To cause a leftward shift, then that is a decrease in heat, a decrease in CO2, a decrease in H plus ions, or essentially an increase in pH, or the use of fetal hemoglobin. Fetal hemoglobin is similar to adult hemoglobin, but instead of the beta chains on it, it's 2 alpha, 2 gamma hemoglobin. Please ignore what I wrote. It's not 2 alpha, 2 delta, it's 2 alpha, 2 gamma. It doesn't really mean much, it's just it holds on to oxygen a little bit better, which is good if you have a fetus inside of you, so that you can actually get the fetus to have oxygen. Now, essentially what you can think of, or the way that you can think of it, is at any given level of oxygen, or a certain amount of oxygen will be able to bind a certain amount of hemoglobin. You can essentially have your bucket, and that bucket changes size depending on a variety of different types of factors. So if you shift it to the right, that means less hemoglobin can bind to oxygen. So less oxygen is bound to hemoglobin, which means less oxygen is held onto, which means, therefore, with a rightward shift compared to normal, oxygen is going to be dropped off. Now that's good when you're looking at all of the different factors, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but essentially when you have respirating tissue, then you're going to have more oxygen that is available to that tissue. It's dropped off at the tissue. Now a leftward shift would make it so that at the same level of oxygen, there's more oxygen that can be held onto by hemoglobin. So essentially, you just have it so that there is more oxygen that can be held onto, or in general, more oxygen is available in the blood. So a leftward shift is actually pretty good at the level of the lungs because it means that at the lungs, if it's cooler and there's less respirating tissue, then you can actually hold on to more oxygen there. The next thing that we have to talk about is how all of these rightward shifts and leftward shifts would actually occur. I already talked about fetal hemoglobin needing to hold on to oxygen better so that the fetus can steal hemoglobin or oxygen from the mother. But in other cases, essentially what we're going to be talking about is what I like to call the equation of life, which is glucose plus oxygen will create ATP. and CO2 and H2O. The ATP also creates heat because that's what ATP does. It creates energy, energy makes heat. The CO2 and H2O will then, uh, in the presence of carbonic anhydrase, be changed into H2CO3 or carbonic acid, or actually that's bicarbonate. That is carbonic acid. I'm sorry. Which will then be changed into H plus, or will freely dissociate into H plus and HCO3 minus, which is a hydrogen and bicarbonate. So essentially, that means that more respiration, which is the first half of that whole entire equation, will lead to more heat and more hydrogen ions, which will also mean lower pH. So more respiration means more CO2, which means more hydrogen ions, which means lower pH. More respiration also means more ATP, which means that in general, uh, if you have active tissue or tissues that are using cellular respiration, then you will drop off more oxygen at those tissues. So the tissues that need more oxygen will get that oxygen. And that is essentially all of what we're going to be talking about as far as the hemoglobin dissociation curve.